Good afternoon and welcome to all. I'm Bob Hamilton. I'm the president of the Fallbrook Democratic Club. Dr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, thank you so much for coming. We are thrilled to have you.
Thanks very much for very, very pleasant introductions. It's a pleasure to come back again to the Fallbrook Democratic Club, which looks slightly larger than the last time I was here. It's not huge, but certainly larger. I call my remarks today Evil Empire. They're about this new book of mine. In politics, as in medicine, a cure based on a false diagnosis is almost always worthless, often worsening the condition that is supposed to be healed. The United States today suffers from a plethora of public ills. Most of them can be traced to the militarism and imperialism that have led to the near collapse of our constitutional system of checks and balances. Unfortunately, none of the remedies proposed so far by American politicians or analysts addresses the root cause of the problem. According to an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll released on April 26th, some 78% of Americans believe their country to be headed in the wrong direction. Only 22% think the administration's policies make sense. This is the lowest number on this question since October 1992, when George H.W. Bush was running for a second term and lost. What people don't agree on are the reasons for their doubts, and above all, what the remedy or remedies ought to be. The range of opinions on this is immense. Even though large numbers of voters vaguely suspect that the failings of the political system itself led the country into its current crisis, most evidently expect the system to perform a course correction more or less automatically. As Adam Nagurney of the New York Times reported, by the end of March of this year, at least 280,000 American citizens had already contributed some $113.6 million to the presidential campaigns of Hillary Rodham Clinton, Barack Obama, John Edwards, Mitt Romney, Rudolph Giuliani, or John McCain. If these donors actually believe a presidential election a year and a half from now will significantly alter how the country is run, they've almost surely wasted their money. As Andrew Bacevich, author of The New American Militarism, put it in the Washington Post recently, none of the Democrats vying to replace President Bush is doing so with the promise of reviving the system of checks and balances. The aim of the party out of power is not to cut the presidency down to size, but to seize it, not to reduce the prerogatives of the executive branch, but to regain them. Let me add a note here. The author of these remarks is a West Point graduate, retired Army colonel, and professor of international relations at Boston University. On May 15th of this year, just less than a month ago, we read in the New York Times casualty list that his son, First Lieutenant Andrew Bacevich, 27, of the 1st Cavalry Division, was killed in Iraq. You may have read the notice that he put in the Washington Post after this. It's about as bitter a thing as I've ever read, and he doesn't mince words. George W. Bush has, of course, flagrantly violated his oath of office, which requires him to protect and defend the Constitution, and the opposition party has been remarkably reluctant to hold him to account. Among the high crimes and misdemeanors that, under other political circumstances, would surely constitute the constitutional grounds for impeachment are these. The president and his top officials pressured the Central Intelligence Agency to put together a national intelligence estimate on Iraq's nuclear weapons that both the administration and the agency knew to be patently dishonest. They then used this false NIE to justify an American war of aggression. After launching an invasion of Iraq, the administration unilaterally reinterpreted international and domestic law to permit the torture of prisoners held at Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad, at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and at other secret locations around the world. Nothing in the Constitution, least of all the Commander-in-Chief Clause, allows the president to commit felonies. Nonetheless, within days after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush had signed a secret executive order authorizing a new policy of extraordinary rendition, in which the CIA is allowed to kidnap terrorist suspects anywhere on earth and transfer them to prisons in countries like Egypt, Syria, or Uzbekistan, where torture is a normal practice, or to secret CIA prisons outside the United States, where agency operatives themselves do the torturing. On the home front, despite the post-9/11 congressional authorization of new surveillance powers to the administration, its officials chose to ignore these and on its own initiative undertook extensive spying on American citizens without obtaining the necessary judicial warrants and without reporting to Congress on this program. These actions are prima facie violations of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 and of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. These alone constitute more than adequate grounds for impeachment, while hardly scratching the surface. And yet, on the eve of the national elections in November of last year, then House Minority Leader, now Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, pledged on the CBS News program 60 Minutes that, and I quote, "Impeachment is off the table." She called it a waste of time. And 6 months after the Democratic Party took control of both houses of Congress, the prison at Guantanamo Bay was still open and conducting drumhead courts-martial of the prisoners held there. The CIA was still using what it calls enhanced interrogation techniques on prisoners in foreign jails. Illegal intrusions into the privacy of American citizens continued unabated. And more than 50 years after the CIA was founded, it continues to operate under, at best, the most perfunctory congressional oversight. It is, in fact, a private army of the president with no supervision at all. Without question, the administration's catastrophic war in Iraq is the single overarching issue that has convinced a large majority of Americans that the country is heading in the wrong direction. But the war itself is the outcome of an imperial presidency and the abject failure of Congress to perform its constitutional duty of oversight. Had the government been working as the authors of the Constitution intended, the war could not have occurred. Even now, the Democratic majority remains reluctant to use its power of the purse to cut off funding for the war, thereby ending the American occupation of Iraq and starting to curtail the ever-growing power of the military-industrial complex. One major problem of the American social and political system is the failure of the press, especially television news, to inform the public about the true breadth of the unconstitutional activities of the executive branch. Frederick Schwartz and Aziz Hook, the authors of the new book, Unchecked and Unbalanced, Presidential Power in a Time of Terror. Schwartz was actually the chief aide for the Frank Church Commission in the late 1970s, Senator Church. They observed, for the public to play its proper checking role at the ballot box, citizens must know what is done by the government in their names. Instead of uncovering administration lies and manipulations, the media actively promoted them. Yet the First Amendment to the Constitution protects the press precisely so that it can penetrate the secrecy that is the bureaucrat's most powerful self-protective weapon. As a result of this failure, democratic oversight of the government by an actively engaged citizenry did not and could not occur. The people of the United States became mere spectators as an array of ideological extremists, vested interests, and foreign operatives, including domestic neoconservatives, Ahmed Chalabi and his Iraqi exiles, the Israeli lobby, the petroleum and automobile industries, warmongers and profiteers allied with the military-industrial complex, and the entrenched interests of the professional military establishment essentially hijacked the government. Some respected professional journalists do not see these failings as the mere result of personal turpitude, but rather as deep structural and cultural problems within the American system as it exists today. In a recent interview, Seymour Hersh, for 40 years, one of America's leading investigative reporters, he is, after all, the man who uncovered the My Lai massacre, for some 40 years, put the matter this way. All of the institutions we thought would protect us, particularly the press, but also the military, the bureaucracy, the Congress, they have failed. So all the things that we expect would normally carry us through didn't. The biggest failure, I would argue, is the press, because that's the most glaring. Hersh's interview at this point asked, what can be done to fix the situation? There was a long pause, and then he answered, you'd have to fire or execute 90% of the editors and executives. Veteran analyst of the press and former presidential press secretary Bill Moyers, Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, considering a classic moment of media failure, concluded, "The disgraceful press reaction to Colin Powell's presentation at the United Nations," that was in February of 2003, when every single word he said was a lie, "seems like something out of Monty Python, with one key British report cited by Powell being nothing more than a student's thesis downloaded from the web, with a student later threatening to charge US officials with plagiarism." As a result of such multiple failures, the executive branch easily misled the American public. Of the failings mentioned by Hirsch, that of the military is particularly striking, resembling as it does the failures of the Vietnam era 30-plus years earlier. One would have thought that the High Command had learned some lessons from the defeat of 1975. Instead, it went to war against Iraq, pumped up by propaganda that the United States was, quote, "the indispensable nation, the lone superpower, the victor in the Cold War, a new Rome possessing full spectrum dominance, and an unquestioned military colossus athwart the world." This was hubristic nonsense that was certain to get the country into deep trouble, and it did. Instead of behaving in a professional manner, our military invaded Iraq with far too small a force, failed to respond adequately when parts of the Iraqi army and Ba'athist party went underground, tolerated an orgy of looting and lawlessness throughout the country, disobeyed orders and ignored international obligations, including the obligation of an occupying power to protect the facilities and treasures of the occupied country, especially in this case, Baghdad's National Museum and other archaeological sites of untold historic value. And they incompetently fanned the flames of an insurgency against our occupation, committing numerous atrocities against unarmed Iraqi civilians. According to Andrew Bacevich again, Colonel Bacevich, next to nothing can be done to salvage Iraq. It no longer lies within the capacity of the United States to determine the outcome of events there. Our former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz W. Freeman, says of President Bush's recent surge strategy, "The reinforcement of failure is a poor substitute for its correction." Symbolically, a certain sign of disaster to come in Iraq arrived via an April 26 posting from the courageous but anonymous Sunni woman who has, since August 2003, published the indispensable internet journal Baghdad Burning. Her family, she reported, was finally giving up and going into exile, joining up to 2 million of her compatriots who have left the country. In her final dispatch, this unknown woman wrote, "There are moments when the injustice of having to leave your country simply because an imbecile got it into his head to invade it is overwhelming. It is unfair that in order to survive and live normally, we have to leave our home and what remains of family and friends, and to what?" Retired General Barry McCaffrey, commander of the 24th Infantry Division in the First Iraq War, and a consistent cheerleader for Bush strategies in the Second, recently radically changed his tune. He now says, and I quote, "No Iraqi government official, coalition soldier, diplomat, reporter, foreign NGO, nor contractor can walk the streets of Baghdad, nor Mosul, nor Kirkuk, nor Basra, nor Tikrit, nor Najaf, nor Ramadi without heavily armed protection." In a different context, General McCaffrey has concluded, the U.S. Army is rapidly unraveling. Even military failure in Iraq is still being spun into an endless web of lies and distortions by the White House, the Pentagon, military pundits, and the now routine reporting of propagandists disguised as journalists. For example, in the first months of this year, rising car bomb attacks in Baghdad were making a mockery of Bush administration and Pentagon claims that the U.S. troop escalation in the capital had brought about, and I quote, "a dramatic drop in sectarian violence." The official response to this problem? The Pentagon simply quit including deaths from car bombings in its count of sectarian casualties. It has never attempted to report civilian casualties publicly or accurately. Since August 2003, there have been over 1,050 car bombings in Iraq. One study estimates that through June of last year, the death toll from these alone has been a staggering 78,000 Iraqis. The war and occupation George W. Bush unleashed in Iraq has proved unimaginably deadly for unarmed civilians, but reporting the true levels of lethality in Iraq or the nature of the direct American role in it was for a long time virtually taboo in the US media. As late as October of last year, the Journal of the British Medical Association, The Lancet, published a study estimating that since March of 2003, there were some 601,027 more Iraqi deaths from violence than would have been expected without a war. The British and American governments at first dismissed the findings, claiming the research was based on faulty statistical methods, and the American media ignored the study, played down its importance, or dismissed its figures. On March 27th of this year, however, it was revealed that the chief scientific advisor to the British Ministry of Defense, Roy Anderson, had offered, secretly, a more honest response. The methods used in the study were, he wrote, close to best practice. Another British official described them as a tried and tested way of measuring mortality in conflict zones. Over 600,000 violent deaths in a population estimated last year at 26.8 million amounts to 1 in every 45 individuals. This is a made-in-America human catastrophe. One subject that the government, the military, and the news media try to avoid like the plague is the racist and murderous culture of rank-and-file American troops when operating abroad. Partly as a result of the background racism that is embedded in many Americans' mental makeup and the propaganda of American imperialism that is drummed into recruits during military training, they do not see assaults on unarmed ragheads or hajis, as the argot has it, as murder. The cult of silence on this subject began to slip only slightly in May of this year, when a report prepared by the Army's Mental Health Advisory Team was leaked to the San Diego Union Tribune. Based on anonymous surveys and focus groups involving 1,320 soldiers and 447 Marines, the study revealed that only 56% of soldiers would report a unit member for injuring or killing an innocent non-combatant, while a mere 40% of Marines would do so. Some militarists will reply that such inhumanity to the defenseless is always inculcated into the properly trained soldier. If so, then the answer to this problem is to ensure that in the future, there are many fewer imperialist wars of choice sponsored by the United States. Many other aspects of imperialism and militarism are undermining America's constitutional system. By now, for example, the privatization of military and intelligence functions is totally out of control, beyond the law, and beyond any form of congressional oversight. It is also incredibly lucrative for the owners and operators of so-called private military companies. And the money to pay for their activities ultimately comes from taxpayers through government contracts. Any accounting of these funds, largely distributed to crony companies with insider connections, is chaotic at best. Jeremy Scahill, author of the new book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, estimates that there are 126,000 private military contractors in Iraq, more than enough to keep the war going, even if most official US troops were withdrawn. From the beginning, Scahill writes, these contractors have been a major hidden story of the war, almost uncovered in the mainstream media, and absolutely central to maintaining the US occupation of Iraq. America's massive military budgets, still on the rise, are beginning to threaten the US with bankruptcy, given that its trade and fiscal deficits already easily make it the world's largest net debtor nation. Spending on the military establishment, sometimes mislabeled defense spending, has soared to the highest level since World War II, exceeding the budgets of the Korean and Vietnam War eras, as well as President Ronald Reagan's weapons buying binge in the 1980s. According to calculations by the National Priorities Project, a nonprofit research organization that examines the local impact of federal spending policies, military spending today consumes 40% of every tax dollar. Equally alarming, it is virtually impossible for a member of Congress or an ordinary citizen to obtain even a modest handle on the actual size of military spending or its impact on the structure and functioning of our economic system. Some $30 billion of the official Defense Department appropriation in the current fiscal year is black, meaning that it's allegedly going for highly classified projects and can be seen only by a couple of members of Congress. Otherwise, you have to be a uniformed military officer. Even the open DoD budget receives only perfunctory scrutiny because members of Congress, seeking lucrative defense contracts for their districts, have mutually beneficial relationships with defense contractors and the Pentagon. We all know about this. I'm a citizen of the 50th District of California, and our congressman is now in prison for 8.5 years for being the largest single bribee in the history of Congress, and the bribers were defense contractors, buying stuff that nobody wanted. President Dwight Eisenhower identified this phenomenon in the draft version of his 1961 farewell address as the military-industrial congressional complex. 46 years later, in a way even Eisenhower probably couldn't have imagined, the defense budget is beyond serious congressional oversight or control. It is also larger than the combined defense budgets of all other nations on earth. This spending helps sustain the national economy and represents essentially a major jobs program. However, it is beginning to crowd out the civilian economy, causing stagnation in income levels. It also contributes to the hemorrhaging of manufacturing jobs to other countries. On May 1st of this year, the Center for Economic and Policy Research released a series of estimates on, and I quote, the economic impact of the Iraq War and higher military spending. Its figures show, among other things, that after an initial demand stimulus, the effect of a significant rise in military spending, as we've experienced in recent years, turns negative around the 6th year. Sooner or later, higher military spending forces inflation and interest rates up, reducing demand in interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, notably in annual car and truck sales. Job losses follow. The non-military construction and manufacturing sectors experience the largest share of these losses. The report concludes, and I quote, most economic models show that military spending diverts resources from productive uses, such as consumption and investment, and ultimately slows economic growth and reduces employment. Imperialism and militarism have thus begun to imperil both the financial and social well-being of our republic. What the country desperately needs is a popular move to rebuild the constitutional system and subject the government once again to the discipline of checks and balances. Neither the replacement of one political party by the other, nor protectionist economic policies aimed at rescuing what's left of our manufacturing economy will correct what has gone wrong. Both of these solutions fail to address the root cause of our national decline. I believe that there is only one solution to the crisis we face. The American people must make the decision to dismantle both the empire that has been created in their name and the huge and still growing military establishment that undergirds it. It is a task at least comparable to that undertaken by the British government when, after World War II, it liquidated the British Empire. By doing so, Britain avoided the fate of the Roman Republic, becoming a domestic tyranny and losing its democracy, as would have been required if it had continued to try and dominate much of the world by force. Never misunderstand. Imperialism is a pure form of tyranny. It never, ever rules through consent. And that includes the British Empire as well as our own. For the U.S., the decision to mount such a campaign of imperial liquidation may already come too late, given the vast and deeply entrenched interests of the military-industrial complex. To succeed, such an endeavor might require a virtually revolutionary mobilization of the American citizenry, one at least comparable to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Even to contemplate a drawing back from empire, something so inconceivable to our pundits and newspaper editorial writers that it is simply never considered, we must specify as clearly as possible precisely what the elected leaders and citizens of the United States would have to do. Two cardinal decisions would have to be made. First, in Iraq, we would have to initiate a firm timetable for withdrawing all our military forces and turning over the permanent military bases we have built to the Iraqis. Second, domestically, we would have to reverse federal budget priorities. In the words of Noam Chomsky, a venerable critic of American imperialism, quote, "Where spending is rising, as in military supplemental bills to conduct the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it would sharply decline. Where spending is steady or declining, health, education, job training, the promotion of energy conservation and renewable energy sources, veterans benefits, spending for the UN and UN peacekeeping operations, and so on, spending would sharply increase. Bush's tax cuts for people with incomes over $200,000 a year would be immediately rescinded. Such reforms would begin at once to reduce the malevolent influence of the military-industrial complex, but many other areas would require attention as well. As part of the process of de-garrisoning the planet and liquidating our empire, we would have to launch an orderly closing up process for at least 700 of the 737 military bases we maintain, that's by official Pentagon count, in over 130 foreign countries on every continent except Antarctica. Let me repeat that. It's in an unclassified document published each year, the base structure report, an inventory of property owned by the Department of Defense around the world. The number right now is 737 American military bases around the world. I guarantee you, you don't need more than 37 of them for defense. The rest are unbelievably expensive and an aspect of our imperialism. We should ultimately aim at closing all our imperialist enclaves. But in order to avoid isolationism and maintain a capacity to assist the United Nations in global peacekeeping operations, we should, for the time being, probably retain some 37 of them, mostly naval and air bases. Equally important, we should rewrite all our status of forces agreements, those American dictated agreements that exempt our troops based in foreign countries from local criminal laws, taxes, immigration controls, anti-pollution legislation, and anything else the American military can think of. It must be established as a matter of principle and law that American forces stationed outside the United States will deal with their host nations on a basis of equality, not of extraterritorial privilege, which they do today. The American approach to diplomatic relations with the rest of the world would also require a major overhaul. We would have to end our belligerent unilateralism toward other countries, as well as our scofflaw behavior regarding international law. Our objective should be to strengthen the United Nations, including our respect for its majority, by working to end the Security Council veto system and by stopping using our present right to veto. The United States needs to cease being the world's largest supplier of arms and munitions, a lethal trade whose management should be placed under UN supervision. We should encourage the United Nations to begin outlawing weapons like landmines, cluster bombs, and depleted uranium ammunition that play particularly long-term havoc with civilian populations. As part of an attempt to right the diplomatic balance, we should take some obvious steps like recognizing Cuba and ending our blockade of that island, and in the Middle East, working to equalize aid to Israel and Palestine while attempting to broker a real solution to that disastrous situation. Our goal, it seems to me, should be to return to leading by example and by sound arguments, rather than by continual resort to unilateral armed force and repeated foreign military interventions. In terms of the organization of the executive branch, we need to rewrite the National Security Act of 1947, taking away from the Central Intelligence Agency all functions that involve sabotage, torture, subversion, overseas election rigging, rendition, and other forms of clandestine activity. the president should be deprived of his power to order these types of operations except with the explicit advice and consent of the Senate. The CIA should basically devote itself to the collection and analysis of foreign intelligence. We should eliminate as much secrecy as possible so that neither the CIA nor any other comparable organization can ever again become the president's private army. In order to halt our economic decline and lessen our dependence on our trading partners, the United States must cap its trade deficits through the perfectly legal use of tariffs in accordance with the World Trade Organization rules, and it must begin to guide its domestic market in accordance with the national industrial policy, just as the leading economies of the world, particularly the Japanese and Chinese, do as a matter of routine. Even though it may involve trampling on the vested interests of American university economics departments, there is simply no excuse for a continued reliance on an outdated doctrine of free trade. Normally, a proposed list of reforms like this would simply be rejected as utopian. I understand this reaction. I do want to stress, however, that failure to undertake such reforms will mean condemning the United States to the fate that befell the Roman Republic and all other empires since then. That is why I gave my new book, Nemesis, the subtitle, The Last Days of the American Republic. I mention the Roman Republic because it was an explicit model in the drafting of our Constitution. Many of you will remember that the great articles defending the Constitution in the Federalist Papers by Madison and Jay and Hamilton, they were always signed Publius. Who was Publius? Publius Agricola, the first Roman consul. That they were thinking back to the first great example of democracy actually implemented on a large-scale basis. When Ronald Reagan coined the phrase evil empire, he was referring to the Soviet Union, and I basically agreed with him that the USSR needed to be contained and checkmated. But today it is the US that is widely perceived as an evil empire, and world forces are gathering to stop us. The Bush administration insists that if we leave Iraq, our enemies will win, or even more improbably, follow us home. I believe that if we leave Iraq and our other imperial enclaves, we can regain the moral high ground and disavow the need for a foreign policy based on preventive war. I also believe that unless we follow this path, we will lose our democracy, and then it will not matter much what else we lose. In the immortal words of Pogo, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Thank you very much. Now I'd be glad to try and respond to questions and comments, and I will repeat them so that they can put them on the film. Yes, sir.
Would you expand a little bit more on Blackwater and its potential for abuse, and why is it being allowed to continue under its present makeup of Congress?
Blackwater is it's certainly one of the most powerful ones, of a private military company. The reliance on them began when Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense in the first Bush administration. He had the great idea that this was allegedly going to be less costly to privatize numerous military functions, turn them over to private industry, where we pay the people who do this work, Kellogg, Brown and Root, things like that, are out 4 times what we pay the average GI. It not worked out that way. It's instead proved to be extremely lucrative for the companies involved. After Cheney introduced this material, he then left the government when George Bush first was defeated and became the chief executive officer of Halliburton, of which Kellogg, Brown and Root is a subsidiary. And they have continued it ever since. It is just about as corrupt as anything you could imagine. There is virtually no oversight on it. Those of you who've served in the armed forces would not recognize armed forces today. You don't do KP. You don't do guard duty. You don't clean up your own quarters. You don't do any of those things that used to be done. That's all done by private contractors, and it's that is to say, Kellogg, Brown and Root collects $100 a bag for laundry, and it's illegal in the military today to do your own laundry, since Kellogg, Brown and Root does such a crappy job. I mean, that many people have, many men in Iraq have said, I'll be glad to wash my own clothes rather than put up with this junk. Blackwater is, that is to say, in most cases, the private military companies have been non-military functions. Blackwater is a trigger puller. They provide all the security for the high command. That is, General Petraeus is defended daily by Blackwater, not by the US military. Nobody reports anything to Congress. This is a private company. What they do is proprietary information. There's no congressional right or ability to inquire into it. It's certainly ought to be stopped. It is, most people in the military are opposed to it because it's been extremely damaging to morale and they also see it to discipline, things of this sort. But it continues because today it's so profitable that the lobbies continue it on. Other questions? Yes, sir.
If by some magic we could get Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rove, Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Ashcroft, and some of these other men in trial, where would we be best to house them after the Abu Ghraib?
Rendition.
In
Rendition.
yeah, rendition. That's a good idea. Or at Guantanamo.
Well, the question was, if we were actually able to hold the current leaders of the government responsible and convict them, what prisons would we put them in? Let me say, I resist the question. I recognize that Bush has gone further than anyone possibly could have imagined. This theory of the unitary executive and things of this sort is simply spurious nonsense that has that's almost in violation of everything that our Constitution stands for. I cannot think of a more anti-constitutional remark than to have the president going about repeatedly saying, I am the decider. We don't have a decider. That is to say, it's been standard constitutional law now for at least a century that the separation of powers does not add to efficiency. It is intended to protect the country against dictatorship, against single-man rule. That it says if you want to make it a policy in this government, you've got to get the agreement of people who disagree with you. That is, you've got to compromise with them. That's what you've got to be good at. I mean, after all, that was the Roman Republic. 2 consuls. They could veto anything the other did. They served for a year. Fixed terms. I mean, and of course they did ultimately succumb to, this is the essential theme of my new book, what happens when a republic inadvertently and rather thoughtlessly acquires an empire. The indispensable accompaniment of an empire is a standing military. That's the military that acquires the empire, that polices it, that expands it. And it draws attention at once to this famous of all presidential farewell speeches, George Washington's last speech, in which he said, the great enemy of liberty is standing armies, and it's the particular enemy of Republican liberty. Now, bear in mind, this speech is still read to every opening session of a new Congress. It's as if anybody listened anymore, or was present when it happened. Probably only Robert Byrd was there. But what Washington was getting at here, of course, standing armies as distinct from raising a military in times of national emergency, invoking the obligations of citizenship, the old Roman legions marching off to war but immediately disbanded the moment the war ended, and returned to their farms. Then once you get long service armies, 20 years or more, you begin to develop vested interests. You have to take care of them after they finally retire, after 20 years. You've got to pay big pensions, a lot of things that they want. Moreover, it becomes very tempting as they get much larger in society for members of the establishment. Julius Caesar was, after all, a former consul. He wasn't just a soldier that happened to wander onto the playing field, who crossed their minds that the really important interests in the society are in the military. Caesar simply said, I'll champion your interests. There's only one thing I want, and it's life dictatorship. Now, of course, that led to his assassination, but then that brought to power a much more ruthless figure than Julius Caesar, namely his grandnephew Octavian, who became the god Augustus Caesar, and who ruled for another 45 years. And this ended the Republic. It did not lead to good government. Remember, the successors were first Tiberius, who withdrew to Capri with a boatload of small boys to take care of his sexual interests. He gave way to Caligula, a genuine madman, truly insane, but who did create the Praetorian Guard, who in turn gave way to Claudius, a drooling idiot, whose wife poisoned him with a poisoned mushroom in order to bring to power one of her sons by an earlier marriage, who was Nero. As I say, this is quite a bit different from the world of Cicero and the Roman Republic. That's what we're talking about here in the case of. That is to say, I agree with the thrust of the questioner, and this is, after all, a Democratic Club. They'd like to hold some Republicans responsible. But I want to assure you that if you're a genuine American imperialist, you'd like Bill Clinton better than you would George Bush. He was much cleverer. He ruled indirectly. He disguised what he was doing by calling it globalization, ineluctable forces, sort of, oh my God, the market made me do it. I mean, that is, it wasn't a plan, or things of this sort. Whereas George Bush just dropped the mask, said, we are the new Rome. We rule through military force. We can rule anywhere we want to, which mobilized anyone who listened to him. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Dr. Johnson, one question. It's a bit broad, but I think it goes to the root of the matter. I'm thinking of what's called American exceptionalism.
Yes.
And whether it's Seymour Martin Lipset who coined the phrase, or whether you're talking about Margaret Mead talking about the idea of an innocent past as being the most dangerous idea in American culture, or whether you're talking about C. Van Woodward in his book, The Burden of Southern History, talking about this myth of American national innocence that goes back to the 17th century. How do we possibly, to use Lincoln's phrase, disenthrall ourselves from this concept that somehow, I believe it was Walter Lippmann who used the expression, that we're just some kind of benign, large Switzerland that's a powerful force out there in the world for good, and we are, as every American high school student likes to say, the good guys, and we don't take our thought process any farther?
Well, it's an extremely good question. I'm not going to try and repeat it. I take it that most people heard it in the room. And the answer to it, obviously, is that's what we have to do. We have to be more realistic about our own history. We need to restore the kind of investigative journalism that we used to have in the society. The people who understand the need to prevent the press being co-opted in the way it is right now. Whether or not that's possible is certainly an open question. Generally speaking, I don't think so. I don't think it is possible. I think it's over. That we are just about today at the same position that our erstwhile superpower opponent was in 1989. That is, and the difference is, whereas the Soviet Union was brought down by imperial overstretch, extreme economic rigidity in its ideology, inability to reform, Mikhail Gorbachev did at least try to reform. He knew that he'd rather have friendly relations with France and Germany than those crummy satellites that Stalin had created in Eastern Europe. We're not even trying to reform. We can't even get the discussion out there on it. So that it's, I agree with you that historians will go back and look at the roots of this catastrophe by our arrogance and ignorance, by our refusal to pay attention. I mean, if the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, go back and read Eisenhower's remarks. They're strident. They're not presidential. I mean, he's really worried about what he created on his watch. And nobody paid any attention. It's now there. Before Miss Lamb discovered Randy Duke Cunningham, I had written a piece in the LA Times just based on his filings with the Federal Elections Commission, saying this man is totally bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex. That his biggest contributors were Lockheed Martin and Boeing and things like that, together with these local Poway operations. The thing that startled me, I received several letters from people in, say, the 34th District in downtown Los Angeles who said, God, I wish you were my congressman. I could use a good job. That's what we do in America. We make cluster bombs and use them to drop on Lebanese children. That's what we're known for around the world today. If that's the way it is, and I live here, I mean, the military-industrial complex has so penetrated the society today. I guarantee you, the state of Washington has two utterly lovely, liberal, democratic senators, smart, intelligent, knowledgeable, female. Say Boeing to either of them, and before your very eyes, they will turn into bloodlusting fascist hyenas. Their function is to keep Boeing in business, to keep them going. The two mother hens of the Defense Facilities Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the states with the two largest number of military bases, are certainly Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and Dianne Feinstein of California. Now, that's their function, is to keep those bases open and working. That's what they do.
Scott Jackson was the senator from Boeing.
He certainly was. So that, you know, it's to say, it's not to denigrate the United States to deny American exceptionalism, but certainly the war in Iraq is bringing home how unexceptional we actually are. That preventive war of the sort we're engaged in is exactly what the Japanese did to us in December 1941. There are many precedents for it. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Johnson, what happened to our free?
Well, the question was, what happened to our free press? Lots of things. Certainly, one is television and conglomerate ownership of it. That is to say, people are in the business in order to sell advertising. And it's therefore PAP. You're just simply, I mean, again, what we're talking about here is what Benjamin Franklin spoke of as a citizen's role. The obligation to exercise
elementary oversight on his government. I guarantee you that if anyone in this room even wanted to, I'm here to tell you, you couldn't possibly. You can't get the information. That's what secrecy has done. That is, even if you really do get up every morning and you're a virtuoso user of the internet, you're going to have real trouble getting close to it. If you're a member of Congress, it's equally bad. I mean, it is. When Charlie Wilson, Texas 2nd District, became chairman of the House Intelligence Oversight Committee, he called his friends at the Central Intelligence Agency and said, I want to take you to lunch. And he said, gentlemen, the fox is in the hen house. Do anything you want to. That's oversight. That's what oversight is today. Mr. Murtha, a good Democratic member of Congress and quite influential, is as crooked as can be in manipulating the military-industrial complex. But he's clever enough to have made an ally of Nancy Pelosi. So that, but to say what happened to the press, partially is controlled by conglomerate. That is to say that people aren't even outraged at the thought that Rupert Murdoch, an Australian fascist, is going to buy the Wall Street Journal. I mean, you know, this is, oh, hooray. This is just capitalism plugging along. No, it's not a great idea. And we're awfully sorry that the family that owns the Wall Street Journal is throwing in the towel. But then there are a lot of other things, including, again, the influence of the military I'm not anti-military. I'm very much aware that there are a great many people in the country today, including a lot of people in the armed forces, who believes it's the only institution in our society that works any longer. It doesn't work in a democratic way, but it certainly functions in a certain sense, and that they have managed to make most of the subjects we're talking about here, particularly imperialism and militarism, simply taboo in this society. In my years at Berkeley, I signed 45 PhD dissertations. I never, again, want to ever read another book that I'm paid to read. But nonetheless, my graduate students used to say to me, you know, don't needle us to take various stands. If you won't, you're invulnerable. You've got a good pension, you're retired, all the rest of it. That's what in some ways, what these 3 books are about, is to try and establish that we can talk about these subjects. Not necessarily the way I have, but we can talk about them. Because there are plenty of young people teaching in universities who know full well that there are boards of trustees looking down their resumes.
2 more questions?
Okay, 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Dr. Johnson, to go back to something that happened just a week ago when Congress passed a so-called emergency supplemental military spending bill for over $100 billion.
Right.
And the thing that disturbed me was this is to last us until the end of September.
Right.
That's 4 months. That's $25 billion a month. I am worried about Social Security and my pension. Any comments?
Well, I mean it my wife keeps saying to me, why don't you try coming up with something optimistic? And I said to her the other day, I've got something really optimistic for you. It's bankruptcy. That is to say, bankruptcy would not mean the literal end of the United States. It might well mean, that is to say, bankruptcy. Germany went bankrupt in 1923. That led directly to the rise of the Nazi Party. China went bankrupt in 1948. The following year, the Chinese Communist Party came to power. 2001-2, Argentina, the richest country in Latin America, went bankrupt. These things would mean a catastrophic lowering of our level of living. But don't misunderstand me. It could happen instantaneously. We know what it would require. All it would take is for Saudi Arabia to decide that we are now going to price oil in euros. The dollar exists today as the world's premier currency only for one reason. The Saudi Arabians, for no good reason, just their old relationship with us, continue to demand to be paid in dollars for their oil. The euro is a much more valuable currency. The yen would be equally valuable. If that happened, the stock exchange would collapse, of course. Howling recession, we would go bankrupt. The entire world would experience a recession. They'd come out of it in about a year. We probably would not come out of it at all. We would become a basket case. And it might well produce revolutionary violence domestically. But at the same time, it's not a nuclear bang. It's just the whimper of insolvency. But we're well on our way toward it. Many of you will remember back somewhere in the Cenozoic when you were taking Econ 101 at some university. And a professor said to you that when a country has a current account deficit of around 3%, then they're in very serious trouble. They're likely to go bankrupt. They're living beyond their means. They shouldn't be able to afford a vacation to Europe. Money should be worthless. Well, our current account deficit is about 6.5% right now. We live off of, and it's financed by the rich nations of East Asia, China and Japan. And it always reminds you of a rather famous remark by Herbert Stein, who was Richard Nixon's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, who, talking about our trade problems, said, things that can't go on forever, don't. That's where we are. It's not going to go on forever. At that point, usually somebody stands up in the audience and says, well, what do you think we ought to do about it? I would say that condo in Vancouver, it's probably time to pay it off, or to have a prepare your escape route. Think hard about what languages you have in the family, or other things that might come up. One last question. Yes, sir.
In our form of government, we depend basically on three documents: the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and we always focus on the latter two. And this weekend, last Memorial Day, I was really getting into the Declaration of Independence, and I was stunned that the majority of charges leveled against King George in 1776 are identical to the charges many are raising.
And they both have the same given name.
But then the question is, are we moving to an imperialistic form of government or a philosophy of government? Do we still have grounding in our three documents?
I think so. I mean, that is to say, if you were to pursue the Roman comparison, you would expect military dictatorship was around the corner. That is to say, the fundamental argument that I'm making in Nemesis is that one of the most unstable configurations in history is a domestic democracy and a foreign empire. You can be one, you can be an imperialist, or you can be a domestic democracy, but you can't be both. If you try to keep your empire, as the Roman Republic did, you're going to lose your democracy. It is one of the, I have absolutely no respect at all for the British Empire, but I still would like to say that in 1945, they did, after the defeat of Nazism, the British did finally come to the conclusion that in order to continue to rule most of the world from London, through, as they invented them and as they called them, administrative massacres, which is what they used, that in order to do that, we would have to turn ourselves into a domestic tyranny. And that was no longer possible. To continue, that is to say, the British public was not going to tolerate Nazi methods just after the war with Nazism. So they gave it up. They threw in the towel and have undoubtedly been much better off as a result. Now, it wasn't perfectly done. Atavisms everywhere, not least of which is Tony Blair, including the Anglo-French Israeli attack on Egypt in 1956, the utterly racist colonial war in Kenya in the 1950s, things of this sort. But still, on balance, I agree with my mentor, Hannah Arendt, in her great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that Britain was a shining light for Europe in 1945 when it realized it had to give up the Indian Empire, and did so sloppily, poorly, and killed a lot of people in the process of it. But at least they did it. That, it seems to me, is what we have to do. It's not just a matter of toying around the edges. Thank you very much for your attention. You have a wonderful club. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor, thank you so much for your wisdom.